Today we're talking about the beating industrial heart and grim truth for Union, the Karrakin Trade Baronies, with a very fancy emphasis on the barony part. Hi, hello, and welcome back to Lancer, our favorite mech tabletop RPG, where we're talking about the noble feudal knights of the future with the Karrakin Trade Baronies. For all the massive grand projects Union holds, all its utopian dreams, pillars, and ideals, all of that is enforced, fueled, even alongside the megacorps, by the Karrakin Trade Baronies. There is no modern-day Union without the Karrakin Trade Baronies. None. It happened with SecCom, is still going on with ThirdCom. It is needed for the utopian dream. It's a debated point, so 1, 2, 3, 4, I think maybe more. It's the grim truth of the new prosperity agreement. Union does not stand on its own without the Karrakin Trade Baronies. They are both interlocked with each other. While there is a Union citizen on a core world enjoying the wealth of all life, cybernetics, biomods, everything at their fingertips with no cost of mana, there's some ignoble suffering on a mining camp within the Karrakin Trade Baronies. Or the rest of their interest. Because yes, it's not just the 9 worlds of the Karrakin Trade Baronies, nor the 9 systems. It stretches much, much farther. But before we head too much into the modern day workings of the Karrakin Trade Baronies, let's learn how this massive galactic industrial powerhouse found its footing. So the history of the Karrakin Trade Baronies stretches way back to before the fall, on one of the first of the 10, the Apollo. The 10 themselves being 10 significant generation ships that were sent out from Earth before the fall. Sent initially both to help with the current running of Earth and the problems it's been suffering, but later on just act as its own continuation of humanity as the rest of the Sol system fell apart. Now, when it comes to the history specifically, compared to all the other megacorps or factions we've covered so far, Karrakin Space has its own field guide. It's dense, or at least dense compared to any of the other faction material we've had so far. So for the sake of that, we're going to be compressing this down real quickly. So we have the Long Quiet, which is all the stuff beforehand, or before what's considered modern Karrakin history, or Karrakin history in general. It's a nice colony, it's left with its own colonial charter, and it's kind of sending wake shipping back and forth between itself and Earth. It's sending raw materials back to Earth, Earth is sending advanced equipment back to them. Wake shipping being just automated ships going back and forth, following in the wake of a colonial venture. So out of everything, relatively normal. It's a sci-fi colony out in the distance, one of the first extrasolar that is. There was plenty of settlements within the Sol system. Then eventually news comes back from Earth. The fall has begun, or at least has hit proper. The Sol system is just an utter wreck. Internal fighting, bickering, the internal biosphere of planet Earth just falling apart, same thing with different colonial ventures. The humans of planet Earth are essentially just all dead, as far as KARRAKIS is concerned. And with that meant that the people currently running the planet, or had the colonial charter, and those currently buying off of Wake Trade and all their current station based off their relation to Earth, began to panic. Panic and power grab. Essentially the planetary governor declaring some kind of martial law, all the different people from the Wake traders, different militant groups, all claiming different factories and locations underneath the colonial governor. Which lasts roughly about, 4 months maybe? Less than a year. As all those different forces and the people rebelling against that, everything just falls apart. It's called the melee. As internal warfare, bickering, the entire colony tears itself apart. The melee lasts 600 years. At the end point, it had turned into basically a feudal state, with different noble barons holding onto different bits of tech, factories, the people they can actually arm, with the original settlement, Karraka, being this entire horrible wasteland. And ruins set up with different scavengers and high-tech banditry. Just a total mess, just a total feudal sci-fi mess. Until eventually you have PASSACAGLIA the First. A pretty much mythological figure now, and so much history that's been edited, any of this can be just taken to be fake. But supposedly, having been ignoble born, fighting and conquering their way through everything else, taking scavengers, forming an army from the ruins of Karraka, eventually uniting the planet. A very unification war situation. And as a part of this, restarting the sciences, studying old tech, taking over ships that were left in orbit mothballed. Not slowly building its way back up or internal fighting or squabbling anymore, but just an instant reboot on what was going on. As it continues on, KARRAKIS begins colonizing different planets, namely its own moon, terraforming that a bit, and spreading out further and further. A relative golden age to a point. Also bumping into an already colonized world and dealing with it. It's also important to note that during this time, PASSACAGLIA didn't get rid of the noble system. In fact, very much still supported it to an extent, or still was a part of it. So within this whole system and different planets being built out and different bits of trade and negotiation and interstellar spreading, it's all still a bunch of different noble feuding houses, with Throne Karraka at its very center. And in said Throne Karraka, a massive load of bureaucracy, which was delayed by time and relativity as well, because yeah, they didn't have blink gates. They didn't even have the fastest interstellar engines at the time. Everything was super slow, decades in between certain shipments between systems. Alongside the different noble houses, feuding, and this just massive Byzantium system, it just began to fall apart and fall in on itself. And at the tail end of the low Passacaglia, you have one of the planets declaring independence. So the current ruler of the time sends one of his generals, Tyran, to go out and deal with that. Massive fleet all set up, most of the forces from KARRAKIS itself sent out to just stomp that. This General Tyran gets there eventually, deals with the problems from that planet, after a long siege of about 7 years. Less long in the scale of a lot of this other time, and more brutal, because this planet was built like a fortress. Eventually getting some messages to be called back over to KARRAKIS, so eventually following that, as apparently there's been some political issue there, and he comes back into the middle of the last argument of kings. So as Tyran comes back, it's a shit show. Everything's a mess. Active fleets are fighting in the middle of the system. KARRAKIS itself has become an entire war zone of different trenches spanning continents. The entire surface of KARRAKIS scarred from orbital bombardment, some still ongoing to an extent. Different factories, bunkers have been built up. The entire planet choked with industrialization just to keep up with this effort. Different ships that have long crashed onto the surface. An asteroid that had been flung over towards the planet and hit the North Pole, throwing the entire weather system off. So it turned out, in the time that Tyran had left, the last Passacaglian died on the throne, with no obvious heir. Technically some, or at least different claimants to the throne with different relations and relativity throwing all of this through a loop, but all these noble houses vying for the central throne Karraka. This event, by the way, the last argument of kings, is documented, at least within Union's own knowledge, as the first large-scale interstellar war. Multiple systems, multiple large-scale fleets, different interstellar projectiles used. Whole mess, whole mess. So Tyran, giving an order to his different commanders and fleets, said to lock down different, essentially radio silence, to debate and think as they now had the largest fleet within the system that he had just entered suddenly. And after months of radio silence, eventually he opens comms to every channel and gives his response. I serve the people of KARRAKIS and its throne. After that statement, multiple orbital bombardments, naval fleet engagements, boarding actions on different ships, and also landing craft heading down to the planet and throne Karraka itself. An all-out assault on a system-wide scale. And in this chaos, this infighting, this mass bit of confusion, Tyran takes it. The throne first, then the system, then eventually sets off on a large campaign on the ANTIANNORUM TYRANNUS to take the rest of the Karrakin Trade Baronies. And as far as they knew, the rest of humanity. With all that going on and some of those details there with the last argument of kings, we enter the ANTIANNORUM TYRANNUS, and it ends with a DYNASTICLADE. An actually peaceful transference of power to a federal monarchy, essentially. Different capital planets would be set up with major houses that would get rid of any of the previous titles. You'd still be able to hold on to them, but the houses themselves weren't connected to any. From those worlds and systems, you would then have a representative that would go to throne Karraka. It is here that there would be a balance of power between the different noble houses and systems specifically. And this is actually where we get the major house system of today. Then we enter the new Federation, which is essentially another golden age to an extent, just building infrastructure, expanding different bits of territory, filling out, building up, all nice things really, just status quo. You still have your scuffles here and there, and duels and conflict are legal, on a small scale, small enough scale. By small enough still meaning entire regiments. But outside of that, everything's pretty fine. No new argument of kings to an extent, no massive houses throwing entire interstellar bodies at one another. Everything's great, and then an old buoy triggers. Not just an ocean buoy, an info buoy that has been sent out along one of the Lagrange points of KARRAKIS. From before the fall, an archaic system that was left behind gets a message pinged from Earth. A message from individuals calling Earth Cradle for some reason. They had come with messages asking if they needed aid, any help to the different desperate humans that had been spread out from Cradle, and instructions on how to build something to communicate back, which the crew at the time found pretty funny because KARRAKIS already had the equipment already installed, or built up. But eventually, messages sent back, and communication begins to go back and forth between the two, still taking forever as it's only light-based, no Omninet still. And eventually there's also physical first contact made, one that the Federal Karrakin monarchy wasn't sure how to handle, with the physical contact being escorted with a noble escort as per tradition declared, making quite a few different old hardliner houses a bit upset. Also KARRAKIS aligning itself and placing themselves within the Union calendar instead of vice versa, because as far as the majority of different Karrakin people believed themselves to be as just the continuation of humanity. Cradle might have been the starting place of humanity, but the actual continuation of that civilization was on KARRAKIS, was in the Karrakin systems, not Cradle, which had thousands of years just being this hellish wasteland and eventually just inheriting all this tech. KARRAKIS was around during those times. It had interstellar wars, it had battles, histories, and yet the federal Karrakin monarchy is just letting these Union people walk in and stomp around as if they're inheritors of the galaxy? That KARRAKIS is owned by them in some way? Relatively similar feelings would be felt over on Cradle as well. Not necessarily the exact same stance, but how dare these Karrakins believe they're the head of the galaxy? How dare they think we don't inherit what they have? They're humanity, we're union. Our whole shtick is to have humanity united. They can't stand apart from that. Our goal is noble. So with these two different sentiments and much issues in between internal politics-wise, both of the government's current feelings on how to interact with galactic politics flip, as the federal Karrakin monarchy itself is pushed to mobilize and militarize, with different people taking seats within it. And over on Union's side, FirstCom is replaced with SecCom, and the first Union-Karrakin War begins. So, outside in the void of space where these two different fleets are meeting, turns out Union just sent a ton of projectiles not towards the fleets themselves that were coming to attack them, but towards the KARRAKIS. This forced the hand of the Karrakin fleet to divert and split itself, heading to these different projectiles to intervene, having itself be picked apart individually by Union ships. Which, even though Union had been left behind time-wise on the scale of Karrakin development, and relatively even fight to an extent, Union itself just had the bonus of all the massive vaults and the tech instantly inherited that had been built up and stored away secretly. So with a relatively even fight then split into smaller quadrants, Union just ate everything up. Though to the Karrakins' effort, they did stop the projectiles, except for one. Didn't hit anything directly, impacted an ocean, killed millions and wiped away a city essentially, and the aftershock effects inflicting on billions. KARRAKIS itself was preparing for a landed invasion, setting up the artillery batteries, mobilizing all of its military forces ground-wise, and all its other local systems scrambling to try and fill some kind of defense, waiting for Union ships to hit their sky. But strangely, those ships never come. The sky isn't filled with massive warcraft. For some reason, the Union ships just turned and left, burning outside of KARRAKIS space. The only sign of something else going on within the Karrakin system is just being that a lot of different tech and AI machines are acting strangely. The reason that fleet, by the way, was taken away is because one of our old friends just woke up, or came into existence, either or. But also, just to note, the fact that machines were freaking out on KARRAKIS itself during that same moment, not just in the Sol system? Holy shit. But outside of that, KARRAKIS begins to mobilize still, the federal Karrakin monarchy is in a no-confidence vote, and voted out, and they prepare for the second Union-Karrakin War. Which, as it slowly heads off to begin sometime later, the Karrakin fleet's just wiped. Just wiped. Not even a chance. Not even like last time with some kind of dirty trick or tactic. Just killed. The reason for this being is the fact that Union now had paracausal tech and specifically NHPs. A particular type and installation called a fleet mind, which is used and basically is the standard for military naval warfare within space, making the predictability gap a joke. You cannot fight when your movements that take months to go into effect can be instantly predicted years in advance. So back at the federal Karrakin monarchy, who knew and heard of these reports of how the fleet was doing, or did, they knew that they could potentially hold out, but billions would die. All of Karrakin space itself would basically be set ablaze, Union itself would probably drain itself or also be blown apart, and they decided to instead reach an arrangement with SecCom. The new Prosperity Agreement, essentially allowing Karrakin Trade Baronies to govern itself, have individual freedoms that are respected by the nobility to an extent, and that Union has to respect nobility-wise, and essentially, even though they're technically under the hegemony, allows them to be their own independent entity in that hegemony. If the Union demands something of Karrakin space, they cannot enforce that. Even to ThirdCom with its 3 pillars, the new Prosperity Agreement is still upheld. They cannot. These 3 things are a joke in most houses. But outside of that, on the Karrakin side of things, they would be the suppliers of Union's expansion, of its utopian dream eventually, but in SecCom's, its conquest. All its navies, all its fleets, all its stations, all its blink gates, its situation for the Omninet and setting up that infrastructure, all of that funded and supplied by the Karrakin Trade Baronies. Because while Union itself inherited some of that tech from the massive vaults and its huge leap in technology when it came to the Deimos event, Karrakin space has been building up for thousands of years and had inherited tech initially that was alongside some of the stuff in the massive vaults. While there are gaps in that technology, the Karrakin Trade Baronies could tear apart stars for fuel, crack planets for their raw ores, take apart entire asteroid belts for resources. They are ridiculous. Tear apart stars. That is not that's in the book. Also having one of their own ring world set up before the first Union-Karrakin War. Mega projects are Karrakin's thing. Well, you have the different megacorps over here, with IPSN with its shipping, SSC with its fine, high-end goods, Harrison Armory being a military-industrial complex. Karrakin Trade Baronies are the extraction. They're the mines. They're the initial on-the-ground factories making raw resources and processing. They're the ones cracking apart planets, tearing apart stars, mining gas giants. They are the raw resource extraction of the galaxy. This institution and this agreement runs so deep that is, again, labeled as the grim truth, is admitted by people within Union itself, that of the levers of power Union has, mana, blink gates, the Omninet, that the Karrakin Trade Baronies, whoever holds that, holds one of the levers to the galaxy. That itself is one of the 4 things that allows Union to operate. To maintain its current utopian dream and lifestyle on some of those worlds and the potential to hold it on the rest of the galaxy, it needs KARRAKIS. Not just as its current form, but what it's doing in its current form. Not just the fact it has this agreement, but the fact it is all this raw resource extraction. These pillars go to the wayside. Okay, with that bit of dramatic flourish, we're almost through with the history. But with that agreement and that grim truth, it goes from the new federation to the Trade Baronies. That's not it yet, we've still got a little more. Because it's the Trade Baronies for a while. It started being called that during SecCom, then you have Third Com's Revolution, then you have the First Interest War, which we talked about under the Harrison Armory videos, but in the short term, it essentially goes that, hey, SecCom's falling apart, Third Com's barely holding any of this together. The Karrakin Trade Baronies themselves saw this as a fantastic chance to take any other claims they had around their own systems. Meanwhile, the foundations of Harrison Armory were trying to conserve whatever they could from SecCom. And so, over this squabble, they fought. And like last time, due to a tech difference and Creighton Harrison willing to just exterminate a planet, they had lost. At least a specific battle, with both sides being forced over by Union under a certain agreement to sign off and kind of stop the whole affair. In the trade, Harrison Armory would keep some of the different planets it was going for in the first place, and one of the previous claims that the Karrakin Trade Baronies had under SecCom, the DAWNLINE Shore, would be upheld. Now, to briefly talk of the DAWNLINE Shore, this is a holy grail galaxy-wise. Colonization-wise, it is 9 habitable planets, all relatively located near each other. A chunk of them within the same systems as each other. And even then, the systems themselves being, even relatively under lightspeed-wise, really close. Like 1 or 2 years in between. Not to mention resource rich as well, not just the planets themselves, but the other uninhabited planets within the systems. This place is a gold mine. While there might be literal gold, it's more for the sense of just galactic scale. So Harrison got to keep some of its purview and its initial claims, while the Karrakin Trade Baronies got to hold on to the DAWNLINE Shore. Theoretically. As within modern times, that's what's looming up to the Second Interest War, with Harrison Armory forces secretly going in and supplanting the locals within the DAWNLINE Shore. But with that, we're actually caught up. Oh, there's gonna be so many videos just on the history alone. That is a very dirty, very condensed summary of all that's there. But in short, we're left in our modern day with an oligarchic interstellar federal monarchy. Oh man, and just to talk about it itself, we'll talk about the planets it's based on, or at least the capital, because there's actually quite a few planets. So, KARRAKIS, initially a temperate Gaia world when it was settled, now it's very much scarred over its various conflicts and its long history. The planet itself is home to Throne Karraka primarily, a palace city itself that is set up on 400 square kilometers. The palace, just the palace estate. Sorry, not 400. 4 million square kilometers. 4 million square Egypt's roughly 1 million square kilometers. This is 4. Let alone that, KARRAKIS City itself, the capital of the entire Karrakin Trade Baronies, is a metro swath, basically a hive city, that surrounds that. That surrounds a 4 million square kilometer palace estate. Within the book itself, it's labeled that there is no city larger with more impact on its planet environment or with a higher population in the entire known galaxy. The city itself left alone to uncounted billions. Not to mention the other 4 large satellite cities that had been placed along the outsides of KARRAKIS City and the other parts of the planet. Or its populated moon. But the largest city in the known galaxy is the home to all of the bureaucratic mess that is the Karrakin Trade Baronies. But alongside the vibe of that city and that development and some of the high-tech stuff, just to emphasize, KARRAKIS has been around and had a 7,000-year head start on Union. 7,000 years! Some of that was with Civil War and the melee on KARRAKIS itself. Some of that was a bit later in the Argument of Kings. But 7,000 years. The mega projects of a ring world able to take apart stars, currently in modern times, a second ring world under construction. That planet I mentioned was basically entirely fortified. Multiple ancient mines that had literally been fortified into underground fortress complexes and bunkers that can handle and withstand multiple planetary bombardments. Some of which, in KARRAKIS' scale, can cause seismic activity the sheer volume. Massive mega engineering projects to edit entire planets just to be more artistically viable and more appealing to the tastes of the nobility that rule over it. Entire terraforming ventures that have only taken place over a handful of years and decades, turning an uninhabitable moon into a luscious jungle. Weapon projects that, when they go wrong, are currently eating apart planets. Enough influence tech and infrastructure to be able to fuel all of Union. Not even the current Third Com Union, which is a lot of hands-off with the diaspora. The active military front union. The SecCom Union. You see, with this infrastructure, to further exemplify the point of how many resources are being sent out, let's say Union wants to build different bits of stations to help with orbital infrastructure, their own ships within another local system, and a Blinkgate under construction, which is a massive endeavor. But also, to hold up the three pillars, they don't want to force any of that effort onto the local planet. So they go to the Karrakin Trade Baronies. With the vast pool of resources in bulk, everything needed for that is sent. A good ton of it as well, with its own shipping. It doesn't rely on IPSN. For another group that supposedly held a good 20 to 30% of Union's own shipping, the fact that the Karrakin Trade Baronies relies internally on itself and entirely on itself for its own shipping, that's another string not attached, but just able to send these things in bulk and to other previous Union core worlds and current Union core worlds being added on, to not have this entire endeavor forced onto industrializing, harvesting resources from their world and system. All of that's shipped in from Karrakin space. But also not just Karrakin space. So you see, when it comes to this resource extraction, and ignoring these three pillars essentially, it's not left to just Karrakin space. The new prosperity agreement is to the Karrakin nobility. The throne Karaka itself, meaning it's wherever those noble titles go. Their bits of ownership, their land holdings, their mining operations in other territories. When it comes to Karrakin space, there's two different definitions for it to an extent, internally at least. You have the concern, which are the core worlds that hold the major houses, and the jewel KARRAKIS herself. And then you have the interest, which is commonly secondhand for the DAWNLINE shore, but stands for any holding outside of the concern. The largest extent of this and the main prize, again that gold mine in space, the DAWNLINE shore being a primary, well, ironically, a concern, which goes into some of the current politics, but the interest stands for the DAWNLINE shore and elsewhere. Different holdings of mines, different bought out locations, different bases, different military functions, their own shipping projects and companies. Any territory or operation they hold outside of the concern, which they do, is described as with Union itself spreading its hegemony and going throughout all of the known galaxy to an extent. The Karrakin Trade Baronies also have their own periphery, which overlaps just as much. While it's not outright planets or no new major houses to an extent, it's all mines here, operations over there, a station in this system tearing apart this gas giant. Making deals with a local diaspora to an extent to have their own military forces placed within their station. Their mining and industrial operations extend much farther than just the concern and just the DAWNLINE shore. They are spread through all of Union. While the majority of the noble houses care to only stay back in the concern itself proper, their industry, their holdings, all those little places an exception, all those mining outposts, all those different stations, these don't apply. There is noble and ignoble. The status quo of how Karrakin space has operated for a long time is still held. All this talk in Third Com wanting to spread these three pillars to the galaxy has to be held up by the situation of the Karrakin Trade Baronies. On top of the potential conflict with the Second Interest War is that inevitable clash of ideologies between them and Union. But to try and ward this off is the fact that a part of the new Prosperity Agreement had a permanent seat within SecCom holding the Prime Baron. Or at least open to the Prime Baron, which this current one has actually been quite profitable with. Current Prime Baron Karabem essentially wants, as a federalist, the general peace and status quo to be maintained. Don't fight a war with Union, remain the general supplier, keep peace between the different major houses, and all is good. Also kick off Harrison Armory. In fact, within CENTCOM to a point, they've held the fourth column, a solid 20% chunk of the entire CENTCOM. 20% of the entire Central Committee, which has actually been on the decrease down 20%. A good other chunk kind of splitting to other different parts of it. But that's going into more Third Com's own politics in modern time. That's a Third Com video. But in short, basically 20% of Union Central Committee is basically Karrakin. But even though there's this talk of peace and this talk of just generally trying to keep the status quo, one thing that has changed over the course of that interest war is a 400-year-long remilitarization campaign. An entire military restructuring within Karrakin space itself, internally. As its current centralized system and its own army had kind of just fallen apart or languished within the own internal house politics and not even being in use. They've now switched over to the house system of house companies, free companies. House companies themselves also not just being limited to the major houses, though there is a major house company. It's all houses. All houses have the right to hold up a house company, and the largest ones have a right to hold a specific strength. This also isn't just land forces to an extent, this also counts logistical and naval. This entire restructuring also involved the Cavalry College talking about and training military mechs, also with Cavaliers being their equivalent of Lancers, the famous Knights, and also Royal Naval Academy, which is one of the most famed within the galaxy itself. All of these house companies, well, when combined, well outnumber the current federal monarchy. But that would be if they were all together to outnumber the federal army. But even with that, and most people looking towards some kind of potential future squabble internally with Karrakin space, namely because they've militarized themselves into separate houses, the gambit was the fact that if anything threatened the Karrakin Trade Baronies itself, they'd be a unified force against it, aka a second interest war. If they weren't internally squabbling or fighting, that would be a massive number of military forces. They're an actual threat on the galactic stage now, not just through trade, but military. Hasn't been used yet, and some people are looking across internally in the concern over how that might be used, but for now, they're a sleeping bear in a certain way. A sleeping bear. To the point that Union itself is just funneling propaganda and insurgent groups trying to spark some kind of fight, or turn in government. That specifically stated that Union is funding or supporting these groups. Which, I mean, yeah, some of them, yeah. Ungratefuls, yeah. Well, with that militarization and those house companies and those different planets and systems, we've kind of talked around them enough, to the different major houses. Because it's always fun to talk about house politics with nobles or the fantasy, sci-fi-esque nobility. I mean, look at Dune. So the House of Smoke on Islet A is currently a moon that's set up around a gas giant. It's the only real hard body landing site around that system, or at least close enough to the initial operations, a large chunk of the population actually on those different stations around the gas giant itself. The nobility itself, however, well within solid ground. Federalist, if I forgot to mention that. While there's plenty more to actually go a bit more in depth on these different realms and these different houses and the planets and systems, gonna be very brief, and very, again, dirty summary. So in short, this was the Australia of Karrakin space, at least after the last argument of kings when all Norm Tyrannus was happening. This is where a lot of the different prisoners were sent. Because Iolete sent that meteor that hit Karrakis. But in its modern history, it's kept up with the mining of different spaceship fuel, it's kind of built up this massive inverted tower within the moon itself, and as a fun note, it has a large immigrant population and noble houses that are all from Spari, or Spar. They are Spari, it's from Spar. The House of Rememberance, Arudai, liberal, the only liberal house. Arudai itself being one of the few houses that isn't on a separate system or planet, it's actually just on the moon around Karrakis. But its task and job originally was set up to be the historians. So on its moon itself, with different bits of forest and gardens to an extent kept by nobility, a central hive city essentially just goes deep within the crust itself, keeping various bits of stores of information and history and artifacts from Karrakis' past. They're actually responsible for a lot of the history that was preserved after Tyrannus had kind of rewrote a lot to the whole burning libraries thing. But the House of Remembrance itself, in its own storage, is this massive wealth of information and a treasure trove of historical artifacts. And a fun dungeon opportunity, that sounds like a blast. The House of Order, set up on Karrakis itself, as we've previously described. A federalist house, aka just keep the status quo. They don't actually own the planet itself. They're still made up of some of the different nobility, but their whole shtick is literally just bureaucracy. They are the bureaucrats. That whole massive bureaucratic mess that was the whole city itself, keeping track of everything Karrakin-wise, all the different ownerships of nobles, duels, bickering house companies, loans, ownerships, that's all them. To the point that their upkeep has almost taken this weird pseudo-religious degree of following procedure. The House of Glass, Ispa Solar Federalist, one of the manufacturers, so not just the raw resource extraction to an extent, but the manufacturing extent. Large mega projects. I think, if I remember, they're the ones either that did the first Ring of World or attempting the second. But very much the SSC in the sense of the fine craft angle of manufacturing. Though it's not just within the styling itself, they are heavily influential in the Royal Karrakin foundries themselves, and their own products and their own construction for their own companies. But also stretching to things like fashion, different bits of televised programs. Their own planet itself is a work of art. Quality over quantity, and a very fanciful, uptight quality. House of Stone, Kairadin, Hagiographic. A previous massive mining operation that had taken most of the planet itself, previously occupied by people even before Karrakis made it here. It is the military powerhouse of everyone else within the Karrakin space. it prides itself majorly on its different house companies, its own free companies that supplies, the different military industrial equipment it can make, and also the one that's been dealing with the issue of the Ungratefuls. A rebel group on one of its system moons, definitely something to talk about later. House of Sand, Tilimsan Hagiographic. A desert world with 2 different polar oceans and rich in resources around its own belt and equator. Though the big thing itself, after several different civil wars and its own internal conflicts with other houses to an extent, it is known for its spy network. And its assassins. But information brokers, assassins, and spies not just within Karrakin space itself internally or for its own house, but also for the federal Karrakin monarchy, the rest of the hegemony. House of Water, Umara Republican. Primarily fishing and farming, generally with aqua farms and just large projects on that sense, especially with its own interior landscape being horrifically mutated. Long story. But a Republican house, so there's no noble or ignoble, and that gets, titles get really strange under that. Because they're still technically a house, and even they're still technically minor houses, they're just now like different levels of government and official positions. House of Moments, Begum Federalist. Its big thing, genetics and clones. They were one of the ones that supplied massive amounts of flash cloning initially within federal Karrakin space itself and over in Setcom. Though they also have a different group that's not technically under the house, kind of. They have the Xenoglossary. They're weird, little bits of potential precognition to an extent, alive mummies in their basement that can see parts of the future, fun but strange, and kind of related to the house but not. If anything, it's tension between the house and them. House of Dust, set up on Bow, Republican, and technically the dying Bow. So when it was taken, it had heavy control over by the federal Karrakin monarchy to an extent, less own individual houses, it was mostly just there as a weapons testing planet, or platform. Different foundries and stations up in orbit itself testing different interstellar equipment. One of those stations ended up falling to the planet, and holding a weaponized version of a terraforming system based off nanites that's currently eating through the planet. Bad time for Bow, and bad time for Dust. And potentially an additional house, the House of Promise. It's not officially one yet, because that's where some of the modern politics come in, because technically the House of Promise isn't located in the current concern. It would become a major house and then become a part of the concern and its whole system, and it's currently set up over in the DAWNLINE shore. So if they made it a house, it would officiate some of their claims over that system, especially with them over the horizon. But also, if it is Republican and comes in that sense, it would sway a lot of the internal politics of KARRAKIS a different direction. But outside of the House of Promise, that's the houses. There's a lot. But in particular, that's the major houses, because you then go down to the regular houses, or the minor houses, which just go to the general nobility. And you could either be people that own entire frickin' moons, stations, different massive plots of land. All of you come together, however, under a major house, because that is just more of a political grouping of things. Different bits of investments and holdings, not particularly tied to one family to an extent, but assigned to one family to represent it. Or at least an individual from one family. The houses themselves and the different planets have different ways of picking, not just the Republican differences, but even internal traditions-wise. But within those houses, you then have the minor houses, and then past that, you have the just general nobility that don't own any land. Still technically noble, still have more rights than the ignoble, which is the other thing. Nobles are the only ones technically allowed to own any land, and own a number of different things, access to travel, some of them don't even have access to leave or go past certain deployments, as in stuck to their own territory, basically serfs, if they're ignoble. Some can leave, some are in Republican houses and are basically equal to an extent, outside of the corruption of, price, inheritance to an extent, that's still an issue. But you have the ignoble, which are just generally serfs to an extent, the nobility, the landed nobility, the minor houses, the major house, Throne Karaka itself. And the Prime Baron a part of that. Though with talking law of the houses, some of the modern politics, and most of other things KARRAKIS-wise and Karrakin Trade Baronies just push to their own videos, because, oh man, this video is already long. We have, like some of the other factions to an extent, their mechs, which have a minor preface compared to some of the others. So when it comes to the Royal Cavalry College, the Cavaliers, and the different bits of the Royal Karrakin Foundries, we actually don't see that much of it. The stuff that's allowed within the book is because you as a general lancer within the galaxy have access to it. Most of Karrakin's actual work and products are left to itself internally. They're not something sold out or mass printed or left on the Omninet. They're not given away. Of the different frames themselves, we have one that was in cooperation with SSC, popular, as in it's just an SSC product or just popular within Karrakin space to an extent. And then it uses a bunch of different Minotaur tech, and we'll talk some of its relation to that otherwise, but in general, all these things are stuff that you can still access outside of Karrakin space. All the other potential mechs and naval vessels, those are just tied to Karrakin. They're not publicly accessed by Lancers, or Cavaliers just from anywhere. So our view into what KARRAKIS actually has is very limited. In saying that though, let's begin with ORCHIS, an alternative frame for the Black Witch, which doesn't mean that this is what's used as the defense thing within Karrakin space Black Witch-wise. No, all that talk of familiars, the weird bits of witchcraft to an extent, and the popularity of Black Witch is still Black Witch. All that magnetic stuff, throwing things around with the different staff, that weird pseudo-mystical spell-like things with the invisible barriers everywhere, that's still very much the wheelhouse of the Black Witch model, and chassis specifically, not just the license. However, the Black Witch and its equipment was so popular, it was adapted to be able to be integrated with a local Karrakin model. That local Karrakin model being the ORCHIS. That is Karrakin made and designed, then adapted for SSC. Where the Black Witch itself was stopping things from ever hitting them in the first place, deflecting with magnets to having this different projectile warding things off, this is a shield. This is a big tank just meant to take hits. Less to tank them in the sense of I'm healing nanites twice or just am physically bulky, it's in the sense that it has the shield to block it. A lot of the internal magnetic components to an extent placed within that shield itself, helping to deflect with that magnetic propulsion and also holding and suppressing itself, adding a bit of suspension on the arm. Also allowing you Captain America-wise to chuck the thing. Also within its description itself, it describes the scenario of ORCHIS models being set up in a large famous shield wall under House Karaka, of a mile-long integrated shield wall. Mile-long! But no, if you want to play the physical bodyguard, the knight with the shield protecting those from behind them instead of the deflecting with a staff or a bit mage-like and spindly, this is going to beat you up still. Also, Captain America chuck a shield as a mech. Of course. Just it's awesome. It is just the frame though. But moving on to an actual license, we have the White Witch. An obvious play, and going off of the Black Witch naming scheme, it is a play off of how the magnetic system is working. Where previously it was used again to deflect those larger projectiles or chuck people around, this goes entirely into the ferrofluid route. All the different little bits of metal to an extent. All that stuff that's that bit of that dark material, individual metal molecules that have been forcefully dragged away and attached to it. While it's initially fragile itself stats-wise, it is bulked up armor-wise. This thing's gonna have the highest armor in the whole game. It just is. And not just for itself, you can apply this and take damage for other people as well by throwing, again, ferrofluid-like onto different targets or making random shield walls out of nowhere, or again, spiking this into someone and then having it dig and just take the metal from them and bury it further. Where the Black Witch was initially defensive, and while the White Witch initially seems defensive, it is so it can get in your face, not to protect someone. Though it can still do that to some minor extent. But also just lore tabs wise, it's got some of my favorite descriptions of a project being tested with the magnetic system. The first run, killing so many people around it. Because its initial testing with the different magnetic system and its metals is it can damage things like mechs themselves. Not limited to mechs. Not limited to metal structures. The initial testing killed everyone around it. Biological. This thing takes metal molecules. It will take your blood. It tore people apart to form its initial armor. And again, the whole one hit point talk with the nanites to an extent of just being able to violently just tear people away. Just gone. Next up on that list of horrific SSC experiments, the Emperor. So while the previous White Witch was man-made horrors beyond my comprehension, this one is man-made horrors taken from something else's comprehension. Because we do know from the previous chassis that SSC isn't scared from using stolen biological parts from something. The Emperor itself also has stolen biological parts from an egregorian mind. Overmind specifically, a tortured one. All of it attempted to be justified within the talks of, breaking down a door within its own lore chat. A scientist attempting to try and justify all the advancements made with the Emperor to an extent in that experimentation. But while the White Witch itself was all about armor, the Emperor itself is all about overshield, which is a previously rare mechanic to have then just one license heavy focus on it. And then also its integrated weapon, which is that massive bow. But if you like guaranteed damage, overshield, and electric bursts against enemies, the Emperor's not bad. And also having a tortured alien mind essentially stuck within your mech. Now the Calendula, a bit mysterious to an extent. Heading off on its lore tab briefly to start off with, a lot of its dating within its code points to it potentially being around and already existing within Karrakin space before Union's discovery of the Minotaur. The initial code for how it functions and works being there before the discovery of that chassis. The fact that Horus might have gotten the code not from themselves or their own internal development, but from somewhere in Karrakin space. But talking about the Calendula, it's an alternative frame for the Minotaur, so all of his previous components and license. But then on top of that, Well, the Minotaur was all about manipulating that internal space to an extent, that external space, making you walk much farther over a short distance, bending space and time a little, and internally having a virtually infinite amount of space to an extent, bigger on the inside and all that. The Calendula decides to say, what if you went to the in-between? Throwing things into a space, or theoretically the onic firmament, just a space in between, or the warp, essentially the warp, where matter is the equivalent of energy or this weird in-between stuff that can be slowly bent and manipulated. It's really funky, it's really screwy. Where the Minotaur was mostly internal manipulation, the Calendula is mostly external manipulation to that extent. Really weird and funky. So both the covering of those mechs, the houses, its rough current time, its history, we have the Karrakin Trade Baronies, and so much more of them to cover. This is already a long video to an extent, but this was going to be longer. And a lot messier. This is already stuff that was heavily condensed. There's videos of just entirely one house coming down the line. And also its own religion that we didn't even touch on to an extent, and its religions. And the Xenoglossary. There's so much more to cover on that, its own internal houses, some of its other politics, dividing federally and internally minor house-wise, the Ungratefuls, its periphery stemming out, but in all of this, it's important to note that KARRAKIS and Karrakin space isn't just its own small little corner of the galaxy. It is its own concern, but with its periphery, with its influence, with its militarization, it is another rival power to Union. Not just with Harrison Armory and its own SecCom roots beginning to threaten that to an extent, or the diaspora slowly going out of control, Onyx space providing tensions internally militarily. But to them and other parts of the galaxy, KARRAKIS is the seat of humanity. Earth fell. Thank you for watching the video, and holy shit. This video was originally planned to be 2 hours. 2 hours trying to condense everything into it. And just, I needed to break it up. It wasn't gonna get done. Initially, that first Sunday with nothing going on was it just still being in that production, then tech difficulties, other issues, just a whole mess. In short though, with all that talk, thank you for your patience. I hope you liked the video itself, even if it might have not stood up to what that 2 hour was going to be. That's what's going to be a lot of other videos coming down the line pretty shortly. But again, thank you for your patience, thank you for watching, and a thank you to my patrons. If I need to thank for patience, you guys getting the warnings ahead of time and stuff, oh man, thank you. Thank you so much. And have a nice day. Sincerely have a nice day. See you later.